Question 1. Governance review demonstrates that ENI's current approach to identifying and evaluating potential operational risks is primarily reactive, relying heavily on post-incident analysis. Considering the need for a proactive and comprehensive risk management framework, which of the following approaches would best align with robust risk assessment principles and regulatory expectations for a company like ENI? Option A. Increase the frequency of internal audits focused on compliance with existing operational procedures, assuming that adherence to current rules will prevent future incidents. Option B. Outsource the entire risk assessment function to a third-party consultancy that specializes in generic risk management frameworks without significant internal oversight. Option C. Develop a comprehensive database of all past incidents and their root causes, and use this data to train employees on how to avoid repeating mistakes. Option D. Implement a structured, forward-looking risk assessment methodology that incorporates scenario planning, expert judgment, and analysis of emerging trends to identify potential risks before they materialize. Correct answer is D. Implement a structured, forward-looking risk assessment methodology that incorporates scenario planning, expert judgment, and analysis of emerging trends to identify potential risks before they materialize. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for robust risk assessment with the practicalities of operational efficiency and the specific regulatory expectations for ENI. A superficial risk assessment could lead to misallocation of resources, missed critical risks, or an overly burdensome compliance framework. The challenge lies in identifying and prioritizing risks that are material to ENI's operations and strategic objectives, while adhering to the ENI hiring assessment test's implied regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes a principles-based approach to risk management and compliance. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and integrated risk assessment that considers both the likelihood and impact of potential risks across all relevant business areas. This approach aligns with best practices in risk management and is implicitly supported by regulatory frameworks that demand proactive identification and mitigation of risks. Specifically, it would involve engaging with relevant stakeholders, utilizing a variety of data sources, both internal and external, and employing a structured methodology to evaluate risks. This ensures that ENI's risk management efforts are proportionate, effective, and aligned with its overall business strategy, thereby meeting any implied regulatory requirements for due diligence and prudent management. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on historical data without considering emerging trends or future uncertainties would fail to adequately prepare ENI for evolving risks. This could lead to regulatory noncompliance if the framework requires forward-looking risk assessment. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes easily quantifiable risks over qualitative but potentially high-impact risks would also be deficient. Many regulatory frameworks emphasize the importance of considering all material risks, regardless of their measurability, and a failure to do so could result in significant oversight and potential breaches. An approach that relies on a single risk assessment tool without validation or cross-referencing with other methods would be insufficient, as it might not capture the full spectrum of risks or could be subject to inherent biases within that single tool, potentially violating principles of thoroughness expected in regulated environments. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with clearly defining the scope and objectives of the risk assessment. This should be followed by identifying potential risks through brainstorming, expert interviews, and data analysis. Risks should then be analyzed and evaluated based on their likelihood and impact, using a consistent framework. Prioritization of risks based on this evaluation is crucial, leading to the development of appropriate mitigation strategies. Finally, the risk assessment process should be documented, communicated, and subject to regular review and updates to ensure its continued relevance and effectiveness. This systematic approach ensures that risk management is embedded within the organization's culture and operations, meeting both internal objectives and external regulatory expectations. Question 2. Governance review demonstrates that ENI's current risk assessment framework has not been updated to reflect emerging operational and compliance risks. Which of the following approaches best addresses this finding in accordance with regulatory expectations for robust risk management? Option A. Focus on immediate, low-cost solutions to address the most visible governance gaps without a formal assessment of underlying risks. Option B. Conduct informal discussions with key personnel to gather their opinions on potential new risks and make ad hoc adjustments to existing control measures. Option C. Implement a comprehensive documented risk assessment process that identifies, analyzes, and prioritizes all identified risks, followed by the development and implementation of specific mitigation strategies and regular review. Option D. Rely on historical risk data and assume that existing controls are sufficient until a significant incident occurs. The correct answer is C. Implement a comprehensive documented risk assessment process that identifies, analyzes, and prioritizes all identified risks, followed by the development and implementation of specific mitigation strategies and regular review. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for robust risk assessment with the practicalities of implementing new controls within a specific regulatory environment. The challenge lies in identifying the most effective and compliant approach to address identified governance weaknesses, ensuring that ENI's operations remain within the bounds of applicable regulations and ethical standards. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both comprehensive and proportionate to the risks identified. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of risk identification, assessment, and mitigation, directly informed by the governance review findings. This approach is right because it aligns with the fundamental principles of good corporate governance and regulatory compliance, which mandate proactive identification and management of risks. Specifically, it ensures that ENI's risk management framework is not only updated, but also demonstrably effective in addressing the weaknesses highlighted by the governance review, thereby meeting regulatory expectations for robust internal controls and oversight. This systematic process allows for the prioritization of risks and the allocation of resources to the most critical areas, ensuring compliance and operational integrity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate remediation without a comprehensive risk assessment fails to address the root causes of the governance weaknesses and may lead to the implementation of ineffective or disproportionate controls. This could result in continued exposure to risks and potential noncompliance with regulatory requirements. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or informal discussions to update risk assessments overlooks the need for a structured and documented process, which is often a regulatory expectation. This lack of formalization can lead to inconsistent application of controls and an inability to demonstrate compliance during regulatory scrutiny. Furthermore, an approach that prioritizes cost-cutting over thorough risk mitigation, even if seemingly efficient in the short term, risks creating significant long-term compliance issues and reputational damage for ENI, as it may fail to adequately address potential regulatory breaches. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the governance review's findings and the specific regulatory framework governing ENI. This involves identifying the core risks highlighted, evaluating the potential impact and likelihood of these risks, and then designing mitigation strategies that are both effective and compliant. The process should include documentation at each stage to provide an audit trail and demonstrate due diligence to regulators. Question 3. When evaluating the potential risks associated with ENI's proposed expansion into a new offshore exploration block, which approach best demonstrates a commitment to responsible corporate conduct and regulatory compliance? Option A. Relying exclusively on historical data from similar exploration projects without considering the unique environmental and social context of the new block. Option B. Emphasizing the immediate cost savings and potential for rapid resource extraction above all other considerations. Option C. Prioritizing a comprehensive assessment that includes environmental impact, community relations, and geopolitical stability alongside financial viability and operational feasibility. Option D. Focusing primarily on the projected return on investment and the operational efficiency of the exploration activities. Correct answer is C. Prioritizing a comprehensive assessment that includes environmental impact, community relations, and geopolitical stability alongside financial viability and operational feasibility. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because ENI, as a global energy company, operates within a complex web of regulations and ethical considerations. When assessing risks associated with a new project, comprehensive approach is crucial to ensure compliance, protect stakeholders, and maintain the company's reputation. The challenge lies in balancing the pursuit of business objectives with the imperative to identify and mitigate potential negative impacts, which can range from environmental damage to financial instability and reputational harm. A superficial risk assessment can lead to unforeseen liabilities and operational disruptions. The correct approach involves a systematic and multifaceted evaluation of potential risks. This includes not only financial and operational risks, but also environmental, social, and governance-esque factors. By considering a broad spectrum of potential issues, ENI can proactively develop strategies to prevent or minimize adverse outcomes. This aligns with regulatory expectations for responsible corporate conduct and ethical business practices, which increasingly emphasize sustainability and stakeholder engagement. A thorough risk assessment demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to long-term value creation. An approach that focuses solely on immediate financial returns would be professionally unacceptable. This narrow perspective fails to account for potential long-term liabilities, such as environmental remediation costs or reputational damage from social unrest, which can far outweigh short-term gains. It also neglects regulatory requirements that mandate consideration of broader societal impacts, an approach that prioritizes only operational efficiency, while important, is also insufficient. Risks to operational continuity can arise from factors outside of immediate operational control, such as geopolitical instability or supply chain disruptions, which a broader risk assessment would identify. Ignoring these external factors leaves the project vulnerable. An approach that relies solely on historical data without considering the unique context of the new project is also flawed. While historical data provides valuable insights, each project has its own specific set of risks and opportunities. Failing to adapt risk assessment methodologies to the particular circumstances of the new venture can lead to missed critical risks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the project's objectives and scope. This should be followed by a comprehensive risk identification process that considers all relevant categories of risk: financial, operational, environmental, social, legal, reputational. For each identified risk, an assessment of its likelihood and potential impact should be conducted. Mitigation strategies should then be developed and implemented, with ongoing monitoring and review to ensure their effectiveness. This iterative process ensures that risk management is an integral part of project lifecycle management. Question 4. The evaluation methodology shows that ENI is undertaking a comprehensive risk assessment, which approach best aligns with the principles of robust corporate governance and regulatory compliance under the UK framework and CISI guidelines. Option A. A risk assessment that relies heavily on external consultants to identify and quantify all potential risks, with minimal internal oversight. Option B. A holistic risk assessment that integrates financial, operational, and ESG factors, with regular reviews to adapt to evolving regulatory landscapes and emerging threats. Option C. A risk assessment that prioritizes operational risks and compliance with immediate legal requirements, without considering broader ESG implications. Option D. A risk assessment primarily focused on financial metrics and historical performance data to identify potential financial losses. The correct answer is B. A holistic risk assessment that integrates financial, operational, and ESG factors, with regular reviews to adapt to evolving regulatory landscapes and emerging threats. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because ENI, as a global energy company, operates within a complex and evolving regulatory landscape. The risk assessment process requires not only identifying potential threats, but also understanding the nuances of applicable regulations and ethical considerations to ensure compliance and responsible business conduct. The challenge lies in selecting an approach that is both comprehensive and aligned with the specific regulatory framework governing ENI's operations, which for this assessment is assumed to be the UK regulatory framework and CISI guidelines. The correct approach involves a proactive and integrated risk management strategy that considers both financial and non-financial risks, including environmental, social, and governance-esque factors. This aligns with the principles of robust corporate governance and responsible business practices often emphasized in UK regulations and CISI guidelines. Such an approach ensures that ENI not only meets its legal obligations, but also upholds its ethical responsibilities to stakeholders and the environment. It fosters a culture of risk awareness and mitigation throughout the organization, which is crucial for long-term sustainability and reputation management. An approach that solely focuses on financial risks would be professionally unacceptable, because it fails to acknowledge the increasing importance of ESG factors in regulatory scrutiny and investor expectations within the UK. Many UK regulations and SISI guidelines now mandate consideration of sustainability and ethical conduct. An approach that relies on historical data without considering emerging risks would also be flawed, as it might overlook new threats or regulatory changes that could impact ENI. Finally, an approach that delegates risk assessment entirely to external consultants without internal oversight would be problematic, as it could lead to a lack of understanding and ownership of risks within ENI, potentially resulting in misinterpretations or incomplete assessments that do not fully capture the company's operational realities and specific regulatory obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory environment, UK framework, and SISI guidelines in this case. This involves identifying all applicable laws, rules, and ethical standards. Subsequently, they should consider the specific business context of ENI, including its operations, industry, and strategic objectives. The risk assessment should then be designed to address both financial and non-financial risks, with a particular emphasis on those highlighted by regulators and industry best practices. Regular review and adaptation of the risk assessment methodology are essential to ensure its continued relevance and effectiveness. Question 5. Analysis of ENI's internal risk assessment process for a newly developed, potentially disruptive energy technology. The assessment needs to consider the implications for future financial performance, market competitiveness, and regulatory compliance. Which of the following approaches best ensures ENI's adherence to market integrity and investor protection principles? Option A. Focus on the speed of disclosure to the market to gain a competitive advantage, releasing preliminary information as soon as the technology shows initial promise. Option B. Prioritize identifying and quantifying all potential positive financial impacts and market opportunities arising from the technology, assuming successful development and commercialization. Option C. Conduct a thorough risk assessment that identifies, evaluates, and plans mitigation strategies for all potential negative outcomes, including technological failures, regulatory challenges, competitive threats, and market acceptance issues, before any public disclosure. Option D. Primarily assess the intellectual property protection measures in place and the potential for patent infringement lawsuits, without extensively evaluating broader market or financial risks. The correct answer is B. Prioritize identifying and quantifying all potential positive financial impacts and market opportunities arising from the technology, assuming successful development and commercialization. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because ENI, as a publicly listed company, must adhere to stringent regulatory frameworks designed to ensure market integrity and investor protection. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for timely and accurate disclosure of material information with the potential for market manipulation or insider trading. A robust risk assessment process is crucial to identify, evaluate, and mitigate these risks effectively. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and systematic evaluation of potential risks associated with the new technology's development and its potential impact on ENI's financial performance and market position. This includes considering various risk categories such as technological obsolescence, regulatory hurdles, competitive responses, and the financial viability of commercialization. By proactively identifying these risks, ENI can develop appropriate mitigation strategies, ensuring that any public disclosures are balanced, accurate, and do not create undue market speculation or mislead investors. This aligns with the principles of fair disclosure and market abuse prevention, as mandated by relevant financial market regulations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential positive financial upside without a thorough risk assessment fails to acknowledge the inherent uncertainties in technological development and commercialization. This could lead to overly optimistic projections being communicated to the market, potentially violating disclosure obligations by omitting material risks. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of disclosure over accuracy and completeness risks disseminating incomplete or misleading information, which can be detrimental to investor confidence and may attract regulatory scrutiny for market abuse. Finally, an approach that neglects to consider the competitive landscape and potential for intellectual property infringement overlooks critical external risks that could significantly impact ENI's future prospects, and thus should be part of a comprehensive risk assessment. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape, governing public disclosures and market conduct. This involves identifying all potential risks, both internal and external, that could materially affect the company's value. Subsequently, these risks should be assessed for their likelihood and potential impact. Based on this assessment, appropriate mitigation strategies should be developed and implemented. Communication to the market should then be carefully crafted to be accurate, balanced, and to reflect the identified risks and mitigation plans, thereby fostering transparency and investor trust. Question 6. The audit findings indicate potential weaknesses in ENI's internal control environment related to data security and access management. Which of the following approaches best aligns with a robust risk assessment framework for addressing these findings? Option A. Immediately implement a company-wide mandatory data security training program for all employees and restrict all non-essential system access pending further review. Option B. Focus solely on addressing the findings that are most easily rectified, regardless of their potential impact on ENI's overall risk profile. Option C. Defer action on the audit findings, assuming that the current security measures are sufficient until a significant security incident occurs. Option D. Conduct a detailed risk assessment to quantify the likelihood and potential impact of each identified data security and access management weakness, and prioritize mitigation efforts based on this assessment. The correct answer is A. Immediately implement a company-wide mandatory data security training program for all employees and restrict all non-essential system access pending further review. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need to address identified risks with the company's operational realities and regulatory obligations. The audit findings at ENI's operations highlight potential vulnerabilities that could lead to financial losses, reputational damage, or non-compliance with industry standards. The difficulty lies in prioritizing remediation efforts effectively without causing undue disruption or incurring excessive costs, all while adhering to the principles of sound risk management as expected within the ENI operational framework. The correct approach involves a systematic and data-driven assessment of the identified risks. This means not just acknowledging the audit findings, but actively quantifying the likelihood and potential impact of each risk. By prioritizing risks based on their severity and the feasibility of mitigation strategies, ENI can allocate resources efficiently to address the most critical issues first. This aligns with the principles of proactive risk management, which is a cornerstone of responsible corporate governance and operational excellence. Regulatory frameworks often mandate such a structured approach to risk identification, assessment, and mitigation to ensure the stability and integrity of operations. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings due to their perceived minor nature, or to implement broad, untargeted controls without a clear understanding of the specific risks they are intended to address. Ignoring findings, even if they appear minor, can lead to the accumulation of systemic weaknesses that could escalate into significant problems later. Implementing generic controls without a risk-based rationale is inefficient and may not effectively address the root causes of the identified issues, potentially leading to continued exposure to those risks. Furthermore, a reactive approach, where action is only taken after a significant incident occurs, is contrary to best practices in risk management and can result in substantial financial and reputational damage, as well as potential regulatory sanctions. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the scope and implications of the audit findings. This involves engaging with the audit team to clarify any ambiguities and to gain a comprehensive understanding of the identified risks. Subsequently, a formal risk assessment process should be initiated, involving relevant stakeholders, to evaluate the likelihood and impact of each risk. Based on this assessment, a prioritized action plan for mitigation should be developed, considering cost-effectiveness and operational feasibility. Regular monitoring and review of the implemented controls are crucial to ensure their ongoing effectiveness and to adapt to changing risk landscapes. This structured, proactive, and data-informed decision-making process ensures that ENI's resources are deployed effectively to manage risks and maintain compliance. Question 7. The assessment process reveals that a candidate for a key strategic role at ENI, Mr. Davies, has previously held a senior position at a direct competitor. While Mr. Davies has stated he has no ongoing ties or confidential knowledge that would create a conflict, the assessment team is aware of the sensitive nature of the role and the competitive landscape. What is the most appropriate next step for the ENI assessment team to ensure compliance and protect ENI's interests? Option A. Ask Mr. Davies to provide a brief written summary of his previous role, but do not involve legal or compliance departments unless a significant issue is immediately apparent. Option B. Request a detailed written disclosure from Mr. Davies regarding his previous role and any ongoing relationships, followed by a thorough review by ENI's legal and compliance departments to assess and manage any potential conflicts. Option C. Proceed with the assessment as planned, relying on Mr. Davies' verbal assurance that no conflict exists, given his stated lack of ongoing ties. Option D. Immediately disqualify Mr. Davies from further consideration due to the inherent risk of employing someone with a competitor background. The correct answer is B. Request a detailed written disclosure from Mr. Davies regarding his previous role and any ongoing relationships, followed by a thorough review by ENI's legal and compliance departments to assess and manage any potential conflicts. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where a candidate, Mr. Davies, has a potential conflict of interest due to his prior involvement with a company that is a competitor to ENI. The situation is professionally challenging because it requires careful judgment to balance the need for thorough candidate evaluation with the paramount importance of maintaining ENI's integrity and compliance with regulatory standards. The assessment team must ensure that any hiring decision is free from undue influence or the appearance of impropriety, safeguarding ENI's competitive position and its adherence to ethical business practices. The correct approach involves a transparent and proactive disclosure process. This means Mr. Davies should be asked to provide a detailed written account of his previous role and any ongoing relationships with the competitor. Following this, the assessment team, in consultation with ENI's legal and compliance departments, should conduct a thorough review to identify any potential conflicts. If a conflict is identified, appropriate mitigation strategies, such as recusal from specific projects or information barriers, must be implemented and documented. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the potential conflict head-on, adhering to principles of good corporate governance and regulatory compliance. It prioritizes transparency, due diligence, and risk management, ensuring that ENI operates ethically and legally, and that its competitive interests are protected. This aligns with the general expectation of professional conduct and the need to avoid situations that could lead to insider trading, unfair competitive advantage, or breaches of confidentiality, all of which are implicitly governed by a robust ethical framework and the spirit of regulatory oversight in the financial services industry. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the potential conflict and proceed with the assessment as if it did not exist. This failure to acknowledge and investigate a known conflict of interest is a significant ethical lapse and a potential regulatory breach. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for ENI's internal policies and the broader regulatory environment that expects firms to manage conflicts of interest effectively. Such an oversight could expose ENI to reputational damage, legal challenges, and regulatory sanctions. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately disqualify Mr. Davies without a proper investigation into the nature and extent of the conflict. While caution is necessary, an outright rejection without understanding the specifics of his prior involvement and whether it poses a genuine, unmanageable risk to ENI is an overreaction. This approach fails to give the candidate a fair opportunity and may lead to the loss of a potentially valuable employee if the conflict is minor or can be effectively managed. It also suggests a lack of confidence in ENI's internal processes for conflict resolution. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on Mr. Davies' verbal assurance that there is no conflict without seeking written documentation or independent verification. Verbal assurances are insufficient for managing significant conflicts of interest. This approach lacks the rigor required for proper risk assessment and compliance, leaving ENI vulnerable to undisclosed issues. It bypasses the necessary steps for creating a clear audit trail and demonstrating to regulators that conflicts are being managed proactively and systematically. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, identify potential conflicts of interest. Second, gather all relevant information through disclosure and investigation. Third, assess the nature and severity of the conflict. Fourth, determine appropriate mitigation strategies or, if necessary, disqualify the candidate. And fifth, document all steps taken and decisions made. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with ethical and regulatory obligations. Question 8. Research into the development of a novel derivative product by ENI, intended for retail investors, has raised questions regarding its compliance with existing financial regulations. Which of the following actions by ENI's management best demonstrates adherence to regulatory requirements? Option A. Prioritizing the rapid introduction of the derivative product to capture market share, with a commitment to retroactively seek regulatory approval if any issues are identified by regulators. Option B. Relying on the product development team's internal assessment that the derivative is similar to existing approved products and therefore likely to be compliant without further external regulatory review. Option C. Engaging an external legal team to conduct a comprehensive review of the derivative product structure, marketing materials, and proposed sales process against all applicable financial services regulations and guidelines, and implementing any recommended changes before launch. Option D. Proceeding with the launch of the derivative product, assuming that general compliance with existing financial market laws is sufficient, and addressing any potential regulatory concerns that may arise post-launch. The correct answer is C. Engaging an external legal team to conduct a comprehensive review of the derivative product structure, marketing materials, and proposed sales process against all applicable financial services regulations and guidelines, and implementing any recommended changes before launch. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid growth and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. ENI, as a publicly traded entity, must navigate this tension by ensuring all expansion activities, particularly those involving new financial products, strictly adhere to the established regulatory framework. The core of the challenge lies in balancing innovation and market opportunity with compliance, demanding meticulous attention to detail and a proactive approach to regulatory understanding. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the proposed new financial product against the specific regulations governing such offerings within the relevant jurisdiction. This means identifying all applicable laws, rules, and guidelines that dictate product design, disclosure requirements, suitability assessments, and reporting obligations. ENI must then ensure the product structure, marketing materials, and sales processes are fully compliant. This proactive and comprehensive regulatory due diligence is crucial for preventing legal repercussions, reputational damage, and potential harm to investors. It demonstrates a commitment to ethical business practices and upholds the principles of investor protection mandated by the regulatory body. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the launch based on a superficial understanding of the regulations or by assuming existing compliance frameworks are sufficient without specific verification for the new product. This could lead to violations of disclosure rules, inadequate risk assessments for potential clients, or misrepresentation of the product's features and risks. Such failures would expose ENI to significant penalties, regulatory sanctions, and a loss of trust from both investors and the market. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed to market over regulatory scrutiny, potentially cutting corners on essential compliance checks. This demonstrates a disregard for the legal and ethical obligations of operating within a regulated financial environment and could result in severe consequences. Professionals in such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This begins with clearly identifying the regulatory landscape relevant to the proposed activity. Next, a detailed assessment of the proposed product or activity against each specific regulatory requirement is necessary. This should involve consultation with legal and compliance departments. If any gaps or potential non-compliance are identified, the product or activity must be modified or halted until full compliance can be achieved. Documenting this process and the rationale for decisions is also a critical component of professional conduct. Question 9. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new, less expensive reporting system for ENI's financial disclosures would result in significant immediate cost savings. However, this system has not been fully vetted against the specific disclosure requirements mandated by the relevant financial regulatory authority, and there is a risk it may not capture all necessary data points with the required level of detail and accuracy. What is the most appropriate course of action for ENI? Option A. Implement the less expensive system and seek an external legal opinion to interpret the regulations in a way that permits its use, even if it means a less comprehensive reporting output. Option B. Delay the decision until a cheaper system that is guaranteed to be fully compliant can be found, potentially impacting the timeliness of financial reporting. Option C. Prioritize regulatory compliance by selecting a reporting system that demonstrably meets all mandated disclosure requirements, even if it is more costly, and then conduct a thorough cost-benefit analysis that incorporates the risks and costs of noncompliance. Option D. Proceed with the less expensive system, assuming that minor adjustments can be made later to meet any identified compliance gaps. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the less expensive system, assuming that minor adjustments can be made later to meet any identified compliance gaps. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because ENI, as a publicly traded company, must navigate the complex interplay between its strategic business objectives and its regulatory obligations. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that any proposed cost-saving measure, even one that appears financially beneficial, does not inadvertently lead to a breach of regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Careful judgment is required to balance economic efficiency with legal and ethical compliance. The correct approach involves prioritizing regulatory compliance above all else when evaluating the implementation of a new reporting system. This is because regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial reporting and disclosure, are designed to ensure transparency, accuracy, and fairness in the market. Adhering strictly to these regulations, even if it incurs higher initial costs, prevents potential legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of investor confidence. The justification for this approach is rooted in the fundamental principle of regulatory adherence, which mandates that companies operate within the bounds of the law and relevant guidelines. For ENI, this means ensuring any new system meets the standards set by the relevant financial regulatory bodies, even if a less compliant but cheaper alternative exists. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize the immediate cost savings of the cheaper, less compliant system. This is a regulatory failure because it disregards the legal mandate to maintain accurate and compliant financial reporting. The ethical failure lies in potentially misleading stakeholders by presenting information that does not meet the required standards, thereby undermining market trust. Another incorrect approach would be to implement the cheaper system and then attempt to retroactively adjust reporting to meet compliance standards. This is a regulatory failure as it demonstrates a lack of proactive compliance and a willingness to operate outside the prescribed rules. The ethical failure is similar to the previous incorrect approach, as it involves a deliberate disregard for established reporting protocols, potentially leading to inaccurate disclosures during the interim period. A further incorrect approach would be to seek loopholes or interpretations of regulations that allow for the use of the cheaper system without full adherence. This is a regulatory failure because it attempts to circumvent the spirit and intent of the law, even if a narrow technical interpretation might seem permissible. The ethical failure is the intent to gain an unfair advantage or avoid legitimate obligations through semantic manipulation, which erodes professional integrity. The professional reasoning process for ENI in this situation should involve a multi-stage evaluation. First, clearly identify all applicable regulatory requirements related to financial reporting and data management. Second, assess the proposed reporting systems against these requirements, focusing on compliance as the primary criterion. Third, conduct a thorough cost-benefit analysis that includes the costs of noncompliance, fines, legal fees, reputational damage, alongside the implementation and operational costs of each system. Fourth, select the system that offers the best balance of compliance, functionality, and long-term value, even if it means a higher upfront investment. This structured approach ensures that financial considerations do not override fundamental legal and ethical obligations. Question 10. Comparative studies suggest that companies facing significant market speculation often struggle to balance proactive stakeholder engagement with regulatory disclosure obligations. For ENI, when faced with widespread market rumors regarding a potential new strategic partnership that has not yet been finalized, which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory best practices and ethical corporate governance? Option A. Instruct investor relations to privately inform key institutional investors about the potential partnership to manage their expectations. Option B. Issue a comprehensive statement detailing the ongoing discussions, including preliminary terms and expected timelines, to preempt further speculation. Option C. Issue a statement confirming that discussions are taking place, but emphasizing that no definitive agreement has been reached and that further material information will be disclosed when appropriate, in compliance with regulatory requirements. Option D. Issue a brief statement acknowledging market interest, but stating that ENI does not comment on rumors or speculation. The correct answer is B. Issue a comprehensive statement detailing the ongoing discussions, including preliminary terms and expected timelines, to preempt further speculation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid growth and the imperative to adhere to stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. ENI, as a publicly traded entity, must navigate this tension by ensuring that all communications and disclosures are not only accurate, but also timely and compliant with the relevant regulatory framework. The challenge lies in balancing the need for proactive engagement with stakeholders and the market against the risk of premature or misleading disclosures that could violate regulations. Careful judgment is required to determine when and how information should be shared to avoid regulatory scrutiny and maintain investor confidence. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent engagement strategy that prioritizes regulatory compliance. This means ensuring that all public statements, including those made in response to market speculation or investor inquiries, are vetted for accuracy and completeness against the established regulatory disclosure obligations. This approach is right because it aligns with the fundamental principles of market regulation, which demand that all material information be disseminated fairly and without undue delay to all market participants. Specifically, adhering to the principles of accurate and timely disclosure, as mandated by the relevant regulatory bodies, prevents insider trading and market manipulation, thereby fostering a fair and orderly market. This also demonstrates a commitment to corporate governance and ethical conduct, which are paramount for maintaining ENI's reputation and long-term sustainability. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss or ignore market speculation without issuing a clarifying statement, even if the speculation is unfounded. This failure stems from a disregard for the regulatory expectation that companies should address significant market rumors that could influence share price. Such inaction can be interpreted as an attempt to mislead the market or a lack of diligence in managing corporate communications, potentially leading to regulatory investigations and penalties. Another incorrect approach is to issue a vague or misleading statement that attempts to downplay the speculation without providing concrete factual information. This is ethically problematic as it can be seen as an attempt to manipulate market perception rather than provide clarity. Regulators expect clear, concise, and truthful responses to market inquiries and speculation, and evasive language can be a red flag for noncompliance. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to release incomplete or selectively disclosed information in an attempt to satisfy disclosure requirements while withholding other material facts. This violates the principle of full and fair disclosure, which requires that all relevant information be made public simultaneously. Such selective disclosure can create an unfair advantage for certain investors and undermine market confidence, leading to severe regulatory consequences. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a robust internal review process for all external communications. This process should include legal and compliance teams to ensure adherence to all applicable regulations. When faced with market speculation, the framework should be: 1. Assess the materiality of the speculation. 2. Consult with legal and compliance to determine the appropriate disclosure obligations. 3. If necessary, issue a clear, accurate, and timely statement that addresses the speculation directly and factually, without introducing new material information prematurely. 4. Document all decisions and communications related to the matter. Question 11. The control framework reveals that a senior manager at ENI has requested immediate access to preliminary financial projections for a new project, citing an urgent need to respond to an external inquiry. However, these projections have not yet been formally approved or disseminated internally. What is the most appropriate course of action for the employee receiving this request? Option A. Escalate the request to the head of finance or the designated compliance officer for review and approval before providing any information. Option B. Forward the request to a trusted colleague in the finance department to get their opinion on whether the information can be shared. Option C. Provide the preliminary financial projections to the senior manager immediately, as their request is urgent and from a senior colleague. Option D. Inform the senior manager that the information is not yet finalized and offer to provide a general overview without specific figures. The correct answer is C. Provide the preliminary financial projections to the senior manager immediately, as their request is urgent and from a senior colleague. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at ENI to balance the immediate need for information with the strict adherence to internal policies and regulatory requirements designed to protect sensitive data and maintain market integrity. The pressure to act quickly can lead to shortcuts that violate these principles. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions are compliant and ethically sound, even under time constraints. The correct approach involves escalating the request through the designated channels within ENI. This upholds best professional practice by respecting the established governance structure and data handling protocols. Specifically, it ensures that access to potentially market-sensitive information is managed by authorized personnel who can assess the legitimacy of the request and the appropriate level of disclosure, thereby preventing insider trading or other market abuses. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory compliance, which mandate robust internal controls over information flow. An incorrect approach of directly providing the information without verification or escalation fails to acknowledge the potential for misuse of confidential data. This bypasses established internal controls and could lead to regulatory breaches if the information is indeed sensitive and not meant for immediate external dissemination. Another incorrect approach of delaying the response indefinitely, without any communication or attempt to follow procedure, is also professionally unacceptable. It demonstrates a lack of proactivity and an inability to navigate internal processes, potentially hindering legitimate business operations and failing to uphold the duty of care to the company and its stakeholders. A third incorrect approach of seeking informal advice from a colleague outside the approved communication channels risks spreading unverified information and could inadvertently lead to policy violations or the leakage of sensitive data, undermining the integrity of ENI's control framework. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the nature of the information requested, identifying the relevant internal policies and regulatory obligations, and then following the established escalation and approval processes. When in doubt, seeking clarification from compliance or legal departments is paramount. The focus should always be on maintaining data integrity, confidentiality, and compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. Question 12. Regulatory review indicates that ENI is considering engaging a local intermediary to facilitate a significant new energy project in a developing country. While the intermediary has a strong local network, preliminary information suggests potential past associations with individuals who have faced scrutiny for ethical concerns. ENI's internal compliance team has flagged this as a potential risk area requiring thorough investigation before any formal agreement is signed. What is the most appropriate course of action for ENI to take in this situation? Option A. Decline to engage the intermediary due to the initial concerns and seek alternative local partners without further investigation to avoid any potential reputational or legal risks. Option B. Conduct comprehensive due diligence on the intermediary, including engaging a reputable third-party firm to investigate their background, business practices, and any potential conflicts of interest, and only proceed if the findings are satisfactory and any identified risks are adequately mitigated. Option C. Proceed with engaging the intermediary after obtaining a written assurance from them that they will adhere to all anti-bribery and corruption laws, and inform them that ENI will not tolerate any unethical conduct. Option D. Engage the intermediary immediately to secure the project and address any potential ethical concerns that may arise after the contract is finalized, relying on ENI's strong internal compliance policies to manage any issues. The correct answer is C. Proceed with engaging the intermediary after obtaining a written assurance from them that they will adhere to all anti-bribery and corruption laws, and inform them that ENI will not tolerate any unethical conduct. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to secure a significant contract, especially for a company like ENI, can create an environment where shortcuts or ethically questionable decisions might seem appealing. However, adherence to regulatory frameworks and ethical principles is paramount, as deviations can lead to severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and loss of stakeholder trust. Careful judgment is required to navigate the complexities of international business dealings while upholding integrity. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented due diligence process that prioritizes compliance with all applicable anti-bribery and corruption laws, including those of the host country and ENI's home jurisdiction. This means actively seeking information about the intermediary's reputation, business practices, and any potential conflicts of interest. Engaging a reputable third-party due diligence firm and meticulously reviewing their findings, even if they raise concerns, is crucial. The decision to proceed should only be made after all red flags have been adequately addressed and mitigated through clear contractual clauses and ongoing monitoring. This approach aligns with the principles of corporate social responsibility and the stringent requirements of anti-corruption legislation, which mandate proactive measures to prevent bribery. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the engagement without conducting sufficient due diligence, relying solely on the intermediary's assurances or the perceived urgency of the contract. Failure to investigate potential risks exposes ENI to significant legal liability under anti-bribery laws, which often hold companies responsible for the actions of their agents. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore or downplay negative findings from the due diligence process, rationalizing them as minor issues or standard business practices in the host country. This demonstrates a disregard for regulatory requirements and ethical standards, creating a high risk of complicity in corrupt activities. Furthermore, failing to document the due diligence process and the rationale for proceeding or not proceeding with the engagement is a critical oversight, hindering accountability and making it difficult to defend ENI's actions if investigated. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant legal and ethical obligations. This should be followed by a risk assessment, where potential ethical and legal pitfalls are identified and evaluated. Implementing robust due diligence procedures, tailored to the specific context of the engagement, is the next critical step. Any findings from due diligence should be analyzed objectively, and decisions should be based on a clear understanding of the risks and mitigation strategies. Transparency and documentation throughout the process are essential for accountability and demonstrating good faith. When in doubt, seeking legal counsel or escalating the matter to senior management for guidance is a prudent course of action. Question 13. Consider a scenario where ENI's internal projections indicate that upcoming environmental regulations will significantly impact its profitability in the next fiscal year. A senior executive, aware of these projections, is preparing a presentation for potential investors and is under pressure to present a highly optimistic outlook to secure funding. The executive is contemplating whether to highlight these regulatory risks or to focus solely on the company's current strong performance. Option A. Wait until after the funding is secured to disclose the potential impact of the environmental regulations, citing unforeseen circumstances. Option B. Downplay the severity of the environmental regulations, suggesting they will have a minimal impact while emphasizing short-term gains. Option C. Proactively disclose the potential impact of the environmental regulations on future profitability in the investor presentation, along with mitigation strategies being considered. Option D. Omit any mention of the upcoming environmental regulations and focus exclusively on ENI's historical financial performance and current operational successes. Correct answer is C. Proactively disclose the potential impact of the environmental regulations on future profitability in the investor presentation, along with mitigation strategies being considered. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with the ethical obligation to provide accurate and transparent information to potential investors. The pressure to meet financial targets can create a temptation to misrepresent performance, which is a serious breach of trust and regulatory compliance. Careful judgment is required to navigate this conflict and uphold professional integrity. The correct approach involves proactively disclosing the potential negative impact of the regulatory changes to ENI's financial projections. This aligns with the ethical duty of transparency and the regulatory requirement for accurate disclosure of material information. By informing stakeholders of the potential risks, ENI demonstrates good corporate governance and allows investors to make informed decisions based on a complete understanding of the situation. This approach upholds the principles of fairness and honesty, which are fundamental to maintaining market confidence and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach would be to delay or omit the disclosure of the regulatory impact. This failure to disclose material information is a direct violation of regulatory frameworks that mandate timely and accurate reporting. It erodes investor trust and can lead to significant legal and reputational damage for ENI. Another incorrect approach would be to downplay the severity of the regulatory changes in internal discussions while presenting a more optimistic outlook externally. This constitutes misleading communication and a breach of ethical conduct, as it deliberately creates a false impression of the company's financial health. Professionals in such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical dilemma and potential conflicts of interest. 2. Consulting relevant company policies and regulatory guidelines. 3. Seeking advice from legal and compliance departments. 4. Evaluating the potential consequences of each course of action on all stakeholders, including investors, employees, and the company's reputation. 5. Choosing the option that upholds transparency, accuracy, and integrity, even if it presents short-term challenges. Question 14. The evaluation methodology shows that a junior analyst at ENI has identified a potential discrepancy in a client's trading activity that might indicate a breach of market abuse regulations. The analyst is concerned about the implications, but is also under pressure to meet a tight deadline for a client report. What is the most appropriate course of action for the analyst to take? Option A. Escalate the potential discrepancy to ENI's internal compliance and legal departments immediately, providing all relevant details. Option B. Discuss the potential discrepancy with a senior colleague in another department to get their opinion on how to proceed. Option C. Ignore the discrepancy for now, as it is not definitively proven to be a breach, and focus on completing the client report by the deadline. Option D. Immediately access the client's full trading history and conduct an independent investigation to determine the extent of the potential breach before reporting it. The correct answer is D. Immediately access the client's full trading history and conduct an independent investigation to determine the extent of the potential breach before reporting it. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information to address a potential compliance issue with the ethical obligation to protect confidential client data and maintain professional integrity. The pressure to resolve a sensitive matter quickly can lead to shortcuts that violate regulatory requirements and ethical standards. Careful judgment is essential to ensure that all actions taken are both effective and compliant. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the situation to the appropriate internal compliance and legal departments within ENI. This is the best professional practice because it ensures that the handling of the potential compliance breach is managed by individuals with the expertise and authority to investigate thoroughly and in accordance with all applicable regulations. Specifically, this aligns with the principles of robust internal controls and reporting mechanisms expected of financial institutions. By involving compliance and legal, ENI can ensure that any investigation is conducted without compromising client confidentiality beyond what is strictly necessary for the investigation, and that any remediation is performed in a legally sound manner. This proactive and structured escalation demonstrates a commitment to regulatory adherence and ethical conduct. An incorrect approach would be to directly access the client's trading records without proper authorization or oversight. This action would likely violate data privacy regulations and internal ENI policies regarding client information access. It bypasses established compliance procedures, potentially leading to an unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information and undermining client trust. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the potential compliance issue, hoping it resolves itself or is not discovered. This passive stance is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for ENI's responsibility to maintain a compliant operating environment. Such inaction could lead to more severe consequences if the issue is later uncovered, including regulatory penalties and reputational damage. A further incorrect approach would be to discuss the potential issue with colleagues outside of the designated compliance or legal channels, even if they are senior. While seeking advice might seem helpful, doing so without involving the formal compliance structure risks spreading unverified information, creating a perception of impropriety, and potentially breaching confidentiality protocols before a proper investigation is initiated. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to regulatory frameworks and ethical principles. When faced with a potential compliance issue, the first step should always be to identify the relevant internal policies and external regulations. The next step is to consult with the designated compliance or legal department, providing them with all necessary information in a structured and confidential manner. This ensures that the situation is handled by those with the appropriate authority and expertise, safeguarding both the firm and its clients. Question 15. The investigation demonstrates that a senior manager at ENI has requested that the accounting team make certain adjustments to the current quarter's financial statements to ensure that projected profit targets are met. These adjustments, while not explicitly fraudulent, appear to stretch the interpretation of accounting policies and could result in a materially misleading representation of ENI's financial performance. As a junior accountant on the team, you are uncomfortable with the request. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Directly confront the senior manager about your concerns, demanding an explanation for the requested adjustments and threatening to report them if they proceed. Option B. Politely refuse to make the adjustments, citing your professional responsibility to ensure accurate financial reporting, and immediately escalate your concerns to the head of internal audit and the compliance department. Option C. Proceed with the adjustments as requested by the senior manager, assuming they have a valid business reason and are within acceptable accounting practices. Option D. Ignore the request and hope that the senior manager pursues it with someone else, thereby avoiding direct confrontation. Correct answer is B. Politely refuse to make the adjustments, citing your professional responsibility to ensure accurate financial reporting, and immediately escalate your concerns to the head of internal audit and the compliance department. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the conflict between a perceived immediate business need and the ethical obligation to maintain the integrity of financial reporting. The pressure to meet targets can create a temptation to misrepresent financial information, which undermines trust and can have severe legal and reputational consequences. Careful judgment is required to navigate this pressure while adhering to professional standards. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the issue through the appropriate internal channels, such as the compliance department or internal audit, and refusing to participate in any activity that would lead to misstated financial reports. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principles of integrity, objectivity, and professional competence expected of individuals in the financial sector. Specifically, it upholds the duty to act in the best interests of the company and its stakeholders by ensuring accurate and transparent financial reporting, which is a cornerstone of regulatory compliance and market confidence. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the requested adjustments without proper scrutiny or escalation would constitute a failure to uphold professional integrity and objectivity. This could lead to the issuance of misleading financial statements, violating accounting standards, and potentially breaching regulations designed to protect investors and the public. Another incorrect approach of ignoring the request and hoping it goes away fails to address the ethical breach proactively and leaves the company vulnerable to further misconduct. A third incorrect approach of directly confronting the senior manager without involving the proper reporting lines might escalate the situation unproductively and bypass established procedures for addressing such concerns, potentially leading to retaliation or the issue being suppressed. Professionals facing similar situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical issue and potential conflicts. 2. Understanding the relevant professional standards, company policies, and regulatory requirements. 3. Evaluating the potential consequences of different courses of action. 4. Seeking advice from trusted colleagues, supervisors, or compliance officers if unsure. 5. Documenting all relevant communications and actions. 6. Escalating the issue through the appropriate channels, prioritizing transparency and adherence to established procedures. Question 16. The analysis reveals that a junior analyst at ENI has identified a potential misrepresentation in a client's financial data that, if overlooked, could lead to a significantly inflated valuation of a proposed investment. The analyst is under pressure to finalize the deal by the end of the quarter to meet team performance targets. The analyst is aware of ENI's internal code of conduct, which emphasizes integrity and accurate reporting, but is unsure of the specific regulatory implications beyond ENI's internal guidelines. Which of the following actions should the junior analyst take? Option A. Proceed with the transaction as planned, assuming the client's data is accurate and that any minor discrepancies will be resolved later. Option B. Proceed with the transaction but make a note in the internal file about the potential misrepresentation without formally escalating the issue. Option C. Discuss the discrepancy informally with senior team members to gauge their opinion before deciding on a course of action. Option D. Immediately halt the transaction and formally report the discrepancy to their direct supervisor and the compliance department, requesting clarification and guidance before proceeding. Correct answer is D. Immediately halt the transaction and formally report the discrepancy to their direct supervisor and the compliance department, requesting clarification and guidance before proceeding. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet targets can create a conflict of interest, where personal gain or team success might tempt an individual to overlook or downplay potential ethical breaches. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions align with ENI's stated values and the applicable regulatory framework. The correct approach involves proactively seeking clarification and adhering strictly to ENI's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines, even if it means delaying a transaction or potentially impacting short-term performance. This demonstrates integrity and a commitment to ethical conduct. Specifically, by raising concerns through the designated channels and requesting guidance, the employee upholds their duty of care and their responsibility to act in the best interests of the company and its stakeholders, as mandated by ethical codes of conduct, and potentially by specific provisions within ENI's compliance framework that emphasize transparency and responsible business practices. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transaction without addressing the potential misrepresentation. This failure to act ethically and transparently could lead to regulatory penalties, reputational damage for ENI, and a breach of trust with clients and stakeholders. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the discrepancy and assume it is a minor issue. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential consequences of inaccurate reporting, which can undermine the integrity of financial statements and violate principles of fair dealing. A third incorrect approach would be to discuss the issue informally with colleagues without escalating it through official channels. This circumvents established reporting procedures and fails to create a documented record of the concern, potentially leaving the employee and the company exposed. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical dilemma and potential conflicts of interest. 2. Consulting relevant company policies, codes of conduct, and applicable regulations. 3. Seeking guidance from supervisors, compliance departments, or legal counsel when uncertainty exists. 4. Documenting all concerns and actions taken. 5. Acting with integrity and transparency, even when it presents short-term challenges. Question 17. The evaluation methodology shows that your team at ENI is significantly behind its quarterly sales targets. During a team meeting, a colleague suggests subtly reclassifying certain service contracts to recognize revenue earlier than is strictly permissible under ENI's accounting policies. Arguing this will help the team meet its targets and avoid scrutiny. You are aware that this reclassification is not fully compliant with ENI's established revenue recognition principles and relevant accounting standards. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Report the suggestion to your direct manager and the compliance department, explaining your concerns about the proposed reclassification and its potential regulatory and ethical implications. Option B. Proceed with the reclassification as suggested by your colleague, as meeting targets is paramount for team performance and company success. Option C. Discuss the suggestion with your colleague and try to find a compromise that slightly bends the rules but still appears acceptable on the surface. Option D. Agree to the reclassification, but ensure that the adjustments are clearly documented internally, even if they are not fully compliant with external standards. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the reclassification as suggested by your colleague, as meeting targets is paramount for team performance and company success. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing a company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet targets can create a conflict of interest, where personal gain or team performance might be prioritized over adherence to established principles. Careful judgment is required to navigate this conflict without compromising integrity. The correct approach involves prioritizing transparency and adherence to ENI's internal code of conduct and relevant regulatory guidelines, even if it means a short-term delay or potential negative impact on immediate performance metrics. This approach upholds the company's reputation, fosters trust with stakeholders, and ensures compliance with legal and ethical standards. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of integrity and accountability expected of all employees, as well as any specific disclosure requirements mandated by ENI's compliance framework and applicable financial regulations. An incorrect approach that involves withholding or selectively disclosing information to present a more favorable, albeit misleading, picture would constitute a breach of ethical duty and potentially violate regulatory requirements concerning financial reporting and market conduct. This could lead to severe penalties for both the individual and ENI, including fines, reputational damage, and legal action. Another incorrect approach, such as pressuring colleagues to overlook discrepancies, directly undermines team integrity and fosters a culture of noncompliance, which is ethically reprehensible and legally risky. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the ethical and regulatory implications of any situation. This involves consulting relevant company policies, codes of conduct, and applicable laws. If uncertainty exists, seeking guidance from compliance officers or legal counsel is crucial. The decision should always prioritize integrity, transparency, and long-term sustainability over short-term gains. Question 18. To address the challenge of a significant, undisclosed environmental incident at an ENI offshore facility that has the potential to impact the company's financial performance and reputation, what is the most appropriate course of action from an ethical and regulatory standpoint? Option A. Immediately inform the relevant regulatory authorities and the public about the incident, its potential impact, and the steps being taken to address it. Option B. Provide a general statement to the public acknowledging operational challenges without detailing the specific environmental incident or its potential consequences. Option C. Delay public disclosure until a comprehensive internal investigation is complete and a carefully worded public relations statement can be prepared to mitigate negative perception. Option D. Inform only key internal stakeholders and begin remediation efforts discreetly, without immediate external notification, to avoid market panic. The correct answer is A. Immediately inform the relevant regulatory authorities and the public about the incident, its potential impact, and the steps being taken to address it. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for positive public perception and the ethical obligation to disclose material information accurately and promptly. ENI, as a publicly traded entity, is subject to stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and maintain market integrity. The pressure to manage public relations can create a temptation to delay or downplay negative news, which directly conflicts with these regulatory duties. Careful judgment is required to balance stakeholder interests while upholding legal and ethical standards. The correct approach involves immediate and transparent disclosure of the environmental incident to the relevant regulatory bodies and the public, as mandated by applicable securities laws and environmental regulations. This upholds the principle of market fairness by ensuring all investors have access to the same material information. It also aligns with ENI's ethical responsibility to operate transparently and to inform stakeholders about events that could impact the company's financial performance or reputation. Regulatory frameworks typically require prompt reporting of material events to prevent insider trading and to allow the market to accurately price securities. An incorrect approach that prioritizes public relations over immediate disclosure would fail to meet regulatory obligations. For instance, delaying the announcement of the environmental incident to craft a more favorable public statement would violate rules requiring timely disclosure of material information. This could lead to accusations of market manipulation or misleading investors. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to conceal the full extent of the incident, would be a direct breach of regulatory requirements and ethical principles, potentially resulting in severe penalties, reputational damage, and loss of investor trust. A third incorrect approach, focusing solely on internal remediation without external reporting, would also be a regulatory failure, as environmental incidents often trigger mandatory reporting to environmental agencies. Professionals facing similar situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying the material nature of the event and its potential impact. 2. Consulting relevant internal policies and external regulations. 3. Seeking advice from legal and compliance departments. 4. Prioritizing prompt and accurate disclosure over short-term reputational management. 5. Ensuring all communications are truthful and complete. Question 19. The review process indicates that while ENI's new renewable energy project shows significant promise, preliminary environmental impact assessments have identified potential long-term challenges that could affect operational costs and regulatory compliance. As a member of the team preparing the investment prospectus for potential investors, you are aware of these findings. How should you proceed to ensure ethical conduct and regulatory adherence? Option A. Downplay the environmental concerns in the prospectus, highlighting only the project's positive aspects to ensure a swift and favorable investment. Option B. Proactively disclose the identified environmental concerns to the investment committee and potential investors, providing detailed information on their potential impact and proposed mitigation strategies. Option C. Mention the environmental concerns briefly in the prospectus, but without providing specific details or context about their potential financial or operational implications. Option D. Delay the disclosure of the environmental concerns until after the investment is secured, with the intention of addressing them internally later. The correct answer is B. Proactively disclose the identified environmental concerns to the investment committee and potential investors, providing detailed information on their potential impact and proposed mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with the ethical obligation to disclose material information accurately and transparently to potential investors. The pressure to secure investment for ENI's new renewable energy project conflicts with the duty to provide a complete and unvarnished picture of the project's risks. Careful judgment is required to navigate this conflict without compromising ethical standards or regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves proactively disclosing the identified environmental concerns to the investment committee and potential investors, even if it might temporarily dampen enthusiasm or lead to renegotiation of terms. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principles of honesty, integrity, and transparency expected of professionals in the financial industry. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit and likely letter of regulations that mandate disclosure of material information that could reasonably affect an investor's decision. By bringing these issues to light, ENI demonstrates a commitment to responsible business practices and builds long-term trust, which is crucial for sustainable growth and investor confidence. This proactive stance also allows for mitigation strategies to be developed and communicated, potentially turning a perceived negative into a demonstration of robust risk management. An incorrect approach would be to downplay or omit the environmental concerns from the investment materials. This constitutes a failure of transparency and honesty, potentially misleading investors about the true risks associated with the project. Such an action could violate regulations requiring full disclosure of material facts and could lead to severe reputational damage, legal repercussions, and loss of investor trust if the issues later come to light. Another incorrect approach would be to delay the disclosure until after the investment is secured, hoping to address the environmental issues quietly thereafter. This is ethically problematic as it involves intentional deception by omission. It breaches the duty of good faith towards investors and undermines the integrity of the investment process. Regulatory bodies would view this as a serious breach of disclosure obligations. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to present the environmental concerns as minor inconveniences without providing sufficient detail or context about their potential impact. This is a form of selective disclosure, which is still misleading. Investors need to understand the magnitude and potential consequences of the risks to make informed decisions. Failing to provide this depth of information, even if the concerns are mentioned, is a failure to meet the standard of full and fair disclosure. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance above short-term gains. This involves 1. Identifying all material information, both positive and negative. 2. Assessing the potential impact of this information on investors. 3. Consulting relevant ethical codes and regulatory requirements. 4. Communicating all material information transparently and accurately to all stakeholders. 5. Seeking guidance from legal or compliance departments when in doubt. Question 20. What factors determine the appropriate course of action for ENI when an internal environmental assessment identifies potential significant ecological risks for a new pipeline project in the UK, potentially impacting project timelines and budget? Option A. The projected short-term financial gains from the pipeline project outweighing the potential costs of addressing the environmental concerns. Option B. The extent to which the identified ecological risks can be mitigated to comply with UK environmental regulations and ENI's internal sustainability policies, even if it incurs additional costs or delays. Option C. The urgency of meeting ENI's quarterly profit targets, necessitating a swift project commencement regardless of the environmental assessment findings. Option D. The likelihood of the environmental risks being discovered by external regulatory bodies or the public. The correct answer is B. The extent to which the identified ecological risks can be mitigated to comply with UK environmental regulations and ENI's internal sustainability policies, even if it incurs additional costs or delays. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with the long-term ethical implications of its actions, particularly concerning environmental impact and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet targets can create a conflict of interest, demanding careful judgment to ensure that ethical considerations are not compromised for short-term gains. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to ENI's internal environmental policies and relevant UK environmental regulations, even if it means a temporary delay in project commencement or increased initial costs. This is ethically sound and legally compliant because it upholds ENI's commitment to responsible operations and avoids potential future penalties, reputational damage, and harm to the environment. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governed by the Environment Agency in the UK, mandate specific environmental impact assessments and mitigation strategies for projects like the proposed pipeline. Ethical guidelines for professionals in the energy sector also emphasize sustainability and corporate social responsibility. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the project without fully addressing the environmental concerns raised by the internal team, perhaps by downplaying their significance or seeking to expedite approvals through less rigorous channels. This would be a failure to comply with UK environmental law, which requires thorough assessment and mitigation of potential ecological damage. It would also violate ENI's own stated environmental policies and ethical codes, potentially leading to significant legal repercussions, fines, and severe damage to ENI's reputation as a responsible corporate citizen. Another incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the financial projections and the immediate economic benefits of the pipeline, disregarding the environmental team's findings as secondary to profit motives. This demonstrates a lack of ethical leadership and a failure to integrate sustainability into business strategy, which is increasingly a requirement under modern corporate governance and investor expectations. It ignores the interconnectedness of environmental stewardship and long-term business viability. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant stakeholders and their interests, including the environment. This is followed by a thorough review of applicable laws, regulations, and company policies. Ethical principles, such as integrity, responsibility, and sustainability, should then be applied to evaluate potential courses of action. A risk assessment, considering both financial and non-financial, environmental, social, reputational impacts, is crucial. The decision should be the one that best aligns with legal obligations, ethical standards, and the company's long-term strategic goals, even if it requires additional time or resources in the short term.